Today, under the sermon titled, The Sabbath Day and God's Law, let us take some time together to study the teachings of God through the words in the Bible. Before we begin the sermon today, I would first like to ask all of you a simple question. Recently, I have heard that the prestige of the Republic of Korea has risen so significantly that when you go to European countries, some of their airports have passages that are exclusively for Koreans. For this reason, many Asians pretend to be Koreans in order to quickly pass through the passage. That is why some of the airports ask an easy question. What is Insunni's occupation? The majority of Koreans know what Insunni's occupation is. They ask 2 or 3 questions that are easy for Koreans to answer. When people answer correctly, they can pass. But if not, they are sent back to a long line. Today, in the sermon titled, The Sabbath Day and God's Law, I would like to ask all of you a very easy and simple question. Let me give you a list of the names one by one. I will omit their titles. Their names are Napoleon, Genghis Khan, Hannibal, Roosevelt, George Washington, John F. Kennedy, Chung Ju-young, Park Chung-hee, Kim Dae-jung, and Roh Tae-woo. Everyone, what do all these people have in common? If you do not know the answer, let me give you a few more hints. Manet, Monet, and Beethoven. Can you find something in common in these names? Did you say that they are all humans? That is right. What else do they have in common? They all have one thing in common. They are all deceased, right? They are famous conquerors, famous politicians, and wealthy people who have all passed away. Although each of them played a role during their lifetime, they are now all deceased. Where are all these people now? According to the teachings of the Bible, just as man is destined to die once, what will come after that? They will face judgment. Some will receive the judgment of hell, and others will receive the verdict to go to the kingdom of heaven. Their destinations will be different. They all have something in common. They were born as human beings on this earth, and they died while living on this earth. However, after that, they do not all go to the same place. We have our greatest desire and wish for when we leave this world. Our greatest desire and wish is that all of us will be able to go to the glorious kingdom of heaven. Let's all go to heaven. There are certain things that God has commanded us to do on this earth in order for us to enter the kingdom of heaven. Today, let us take a look at these things under the sermon titled, The Sabbath Day and God's Law. What must those who believe in God do? Meaning, what must those who want to go to the kingdom of heaven do? Regarding this, let us find the answer through the teaching written in Deuteronomy chapter 28. Let's take a look at Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 58. If you do not carefully follow all the words of this law, which are written in this book, and do not revere this glorious and awesome name, the Lord your God, the Lord will send fearful plagues on you and your descendants, harsh and prolonged disasters, and severe and lingering illnesses. According to verse 58, if you do not carefully follow all the words of God that are written in this book, what will happen? In verse 59, it says, God will send fearful plagues on you and your descendants. Here, God is teaching us to keep His law carefully, isn't He? Let's move on to Deuteronomy chapter 31. In chapter 31, verse 11, it says, "When all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God at the place he will choose, you shall read this law before them in their hearing. Assemble the people, men, women, and children, and the aliens living in your towns, so they can," what can they do? Listen, and what else can they do? Learn to. What can they learn to do? Fear the Lord your God and follow carefully all the words of this law. This law is given not only to the Israelites, but also to the aliens. What did God command them to do? He commanded them to learn and follow the law of God. The law of God is a law for all mankind. Since the churches in the world do not keep the Sabbath day, they often babble by saying, "This law was given to the Jews." It has nothing to do with us today. We can be saved only by faith. According to God's teachings, written here, whose will is it that we should learn and keep this law, whether we are foreigners or the Israelites? This is the will of God. Then, we do not revere God arbitrarily. There is a regulation in every worship and every sacrifice. Today, among many laws, let us take a look at the law of the Sabbath day written in the Bible. God told the Israelites that he would establish the relationship between God and his people through the regulation called the Sabbath day. Let's take a look at the teachings written in Exodus chapter 20, verse 8. Exodus chapter 20 is the chapter where the law of God was proclaimed. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it, the Sabbath day, holy. Verse 9, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your manservant or maidservant, nor your animals, nor the alien within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord, what did he do? Blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. It implies that both the Sabbath day, which is the seventh day of the week, and the ceremonies of worship on the Sabbath day are important, doesn't it? God reveals his teachings through this commandment. There are numerous churches around us today. Through the teaching of the Sabbath day, we need to confirm whether or not these churches are on the right path, heading toward the kingdom of heaven, following God's laws correctly. Not everyone who says, "I believe in God," and blindly goes to church can enter the kingdom of heaven. That is why God called the Sabbath day Sabbath of God. By putting his name on it, God shows the Sabbath day belongs to him. The Lord blessed the Sabbath day, and what did he do? Made it holy. According to Exodus chapter 20, God established the Sabbath day. God made the Sabbath day holy, and God blessed the Sabbath day. In this way, God proclaimed the significance of the Sabbath day. Let us take a look at the origin of how the Sabbath day was appointed through Genesis chapter 2. Let's look at Genesis chapter 2, verse 1. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. What day of the week did God finish the creation work? Please remember this seventh day. By the seventh day, God had finished the work. So on the seventh day, what did he do? To let us know that it is the day of rest, he rested from all his work. Let us continue with verse 3. And God blessed. Which day did he bless? The seventh day, and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. The Sabbath day not only contains the meaning of the seventh day of the week, but also contains God's promise of blessing us and making us holy. Since this is not a man-made law, but God's law that God has commanded us to keep, can a mere man change God's law in accordance with his own discretion? God's law must never be changed. Since God has blessed the seventh day, we should receive blessings on that day. Today, many churches all over the world, like the sand on the seashore, keep worship on Sunday. However, we worship on the Sabbath day, Saturday. What difference does it make? Some might say, as long as we worship God, it does not matter whether we worship God on Saturday or on Sunday. Even though this may sound very plausible, it is not plausible at all. It is because the Sabbath day is a law that God has commanded us to follow. God's decrees, regulations, and laws are very important principles that God has established in order to lead us to the kingdom of heaven. So, what does God command us to do by remembering the seventh day, the Sabbath day? He commands us to keep it holy. If it does not matter whether we choose any day, Sunday or Saturday, then we do not need to remember this day, the Sabbath day, right? However, God clearly said, remember the Sabbath day. There were sacrifices offered by Abel and Cain. Abel offered sacrifice in accordance with God's will, and Cain offered sacrifice according to his own will. Were the sacrifices offered according to Cain's own will accepted? All his efforts were in vain. The Sabbath day we are keeping today was established according to God's will, for us to commemorate the power of the Creator who created the heavens and the earth, and to give glory to Him. There are people in the world who easily choose their own way to the kingdom of heaven. We can never reach the kingdom of heaven if it is not the path that God has set for us. Let's take a look at the book of Exodus chapter 31, verse 13. In chapter 31, verse 13, it says, "Say to the Israelites, this is what God says. You must observe my Sabbaths. This will be," what will this be? "A sign between me and you for the generations to come." Let's see what the meaning of the sign is. "So you may know that I am the Lord who makes you holy." Through what act will God distinguish who we are? Through the act of keeping the Sabbath day, God will be our God. Then what will become of us? This means that God will allow us to become His people. Let's continue with verse 14. "Observe the Sabbath because it is holy to you. Anyone who desecrates it must be," what will happen to them? They will be put to death. In the Old Testament, they were physically put to death. In the age of the New Testament, we will spiritually be put to death. This is God's regulation. To put it simply, this is a very important law that God has given to mankind so that we can enter the kingdom of heaven. That is why God said, "Whoever does any work on that day must be cut off from his people." Verse 15 says, "For 6 days work is to be done, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day must be put to death." The Israelites are to observe the Sabbath, celebrating it for the generations to come as a lasting covenant. It will be a sign between me and the Israelites forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day He abstained from work and rested. God commands all mankind to learn this law so that all of us can keep it together. Some people might ask, is the Sabbath day that important? Yes, it is very important. It is not me saying that it is important. God has taught us that the Sabbath day is important. Thus, we should preach God's teachings to all mankind, shouldn't we? Let's move on to Ezekiel chapter 20. In Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 11, it says, I gave them my decrees and made known to them my laws, for the man who obeys them will live by them. The decrees, laws, and regulations all mean the same thing. Let us continue with verse 12. Also, I gave them my... What did God give them? Sabbaths as... What are the Sabbaths? A sign between us, so they would know that I, the Lord, made them holy. God will be our God, and we will be God's people. This relationship between God and us is established through the Sabbath day. If the Sabbath day, the sign between God and his people, were not observed, what would happen to the relationship with God? The relationship with God would inevitably be broken. In other words, this means that we cannot be saved. Let's continue with verse 13. Yet the people of Israel rebelled against me in the desert. They did not follow my decrees, but rejected my laws, although the man who obeys them will live by them. And they utterly desecrated my Sabbaths. Desecrating the Sabbath means that they do not observe the Sabbath day, doesn't it? If we do not keep the Sabbath day, completely ignoring all the laws that God has given us, but claim to be God's people who believe in God, would this make any sense? It does not make any sense. Let's confirm God's absolute will regarding this matter. Let us turn to Matthew chapter 7. In Matthew chapter 7, verse 21, it says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord.'" Here, everyone who says, "Lord, Lord," refers to everyone who believes in God, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does. What must he do to enter heaven? He must do the will of my Father who is in heaven. The Sabbath day is the truth established according to the will of God, and it is the law of God. Jesus clearly confirmed that we can never enter the kingdom of heaven just by calling out to him, Jesus, Jesus. Let us continue with verse 22. Many will say to me on that day, "Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and perform many miracles?" Then I will tell them plainly. What will God say to them? "I never knew you." They drove out demons in the name of the Lord. They prophesied in the name of the Lord. They performed all kinds of miracles in the name of the Lord. However, Jesus said that he never knew them. What is the reason for this? What did they practice? "Away from me, you evildoers." God has established the law for the salvation of mankind. God established the law of the Old Covenant in the Old Testament and the law of the New Covenant in the New Testament. God wants us to follow the law as it is and return to the eternal kingdom of heaven. However, many people say, we just need to have faith. Do we really have to analyze God's words one by one? Yes, we need to confirm them one by one. How precious is our soul? On this earth, people say that life lasts 70 to 80 years. What about the life in heaven? Isn't heaven an eternal world? We must go to that world. If there are any obstacles on our way to the kingdom of heaven, we must recognize these obstacles and overcome them. According to the command we have examined today, keep the Sabbath day. Isn't it lawlessness to not keep the Sabbath day? Then we can conclude that those who do not keep the Sabbath day will not be able to enter the kingdom of heaven where Jesus dwells. Jesus said, "Away from me, you who practice lawlessness." There are many regulations and decrees of God. There are the laws that we must obey. While ignoring all the laws of God, we cannot say, "I believe in God." In other words, if we do not keep the Sabbath day, which is God's law, we will not be able to enter the kingdom of heaven. On that day, they will confidently say to Jesus, "In your name I drove out demons. I served as shepherd and prophet in the name of the Lord. I held all kinds of important positions. However, Jesus will ask firmly, "Did you keep the Sabbath day?" "I did not keep it." "What did you keep?" "I kept Sunday worship." "Away from me." What is God's law between God and his people? It is a sign between God and his people. However, since they show him only the mark of worshiping the sun god, God will reject all of them, saying, "The place you will enter is not the kingdom of heaven." On the other hand, those who obey God's laws, decrees, and regulations will enter the kingdom of heaven, won't they? Although God rejects those who practice lawlessness, God clearly shows us that those who obey God's laws, decrees, and regulations faithfully, according to the teachings of God, will surely enter the eternal kingdom of heaven. In regard to this matter, let us take a look at the scene where God shows us his firm will. Let us turn to Ezekiel chapter 22, verse 26. The priests mentioned here are equivalent to the pastors today. Her priests do violence to. What do they do violence to? My law and profane my holy things. They do not distinguish between the holy and the common. They teach that there is no difference between the unclean and the clean, and they shut their eyes to. What do they shut their eyes to? The keeping of my Sabbaths, so that I am profaned among them. These priests are not glorifying God. Rather, they are in the position of dishonoring God, profaning him, and desecrating his glory. What kind of act is regarded as profaning God? They shut their eyes to the keeping of God's Sabbath. In other words, they do not keep the Sabbath day. Then let us see what kind of people they are in verse 27. Her officials within her are like. What are they like? Wolves tearing their prey. They shed blood and, what do? Kill people to make unjust gain. The Bible says that they are not saving souls. Instead, they are killing souls. Who are they? They are those who do not keep the Sabbath day. These people claim to be prophets and pastors, but do not lead people according to God's law. They are like wolves tearing their prey. They shed blood and kill people to make unjust gain. Let us continue with verse 28. Her prophets whitewash these deeds for them by false visions and lying divinations. They say, "This is what the sovereign Lord says," when the Lord has not spoken. They say, "This is what the sovereign Lord says," even though God has not spoken those things. Has God ever commanded us to keep Sunday holy? There is no such command in God's law. However, the place where they keep such rules is disguised as the true church. How tragic is this? Therefore, through which gate does God tell us to enter? He tells us to enter through the narrow gate. Although only a few people find this gate, since it is the way of life, God teaches us to find that gate and enter through it. There are so many churches on the earth. Do they follow God's laws, decrees, and his teachings as they are? We must discern their true identity. You and I are now keeping the Sabbath day. We keep worship on Saturday, whereas the majority of other churches keep worship on Sunday. This single fact, that they keep worship on Sunday, proves that they are practicing lawlessness, just as it is written in Matthew chapter 7. They are spiritually practicing lawlessness. On the last day, God will say to them, "I never knew you. Away from me, you who practice lawlessness. You are the ones who profane me. You are killing souls as wolves kill their prey." Through the prophet Ezekiel, God clearly revealed their identities by pointing out what they do. If we say, "I believe in God," then we must obey God's law. Among God's laws, there is a law called the Sabbath day, but there is no law called Sunday worship. Then when did the law of Sunday worship start? Jesus showed all mankind his amazing power and grace of redemption through the cross. On the third day after his crucifixion, he rose from the dead. Then he ascended to heaven 40 days after his resurrection. 10 days later, on the day of Pentecost, the Holy Spirit of the former rain was poured out on 120 saints who were gathered in Mark's upper room. From then on, the truth of the new covenant established by Jesus began to be preached throughout the world. That was around the 1st century. At that time, Rome had a religion of worshiping the sun god. As a result, most of the regulations that Christians are practicing today are related to worshiping the sun god. Sunday worship was the day when Romans worshipped the sun god once a week. Christmas was the day when they celebrated the birthday of the sun god. All of these regulations have been adopted into the church and are now disguised as God's laws. What does God say about this? God says, "I am being profaned among you who do not keep my law." When we look at all these things, the Sabbath day is God's truth that must be restored and regarded as sacred. Only those who acknowledge that God created the heavens and the earth and all things can keep this truth of the Sabbath day. It is not just a matter of saying, we keep worship on Saturday and they keep worship on Sunday. Instead, it is a very important law of God that clearly distinguishes whether we are God's people or not from His perspective. Let us turn to Mark chapter 16, verse 9. Chapter 16, verse 9 says, "When Jesus rose early on the first day of the week, the Sabbath day is the 7th day." In Israel, the days of the week were continuously circulated as follows: the first day, the second day, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, and the 7th day. Since they have the 7-day cycle, what day is after the 7th day? It must be the first day. Since the Sabbath day is the 7th day, we can say that in verse 9, Jesus rose early on the first day, the day after the 7th day. Jesus rose means that he was resurrected. The fact that Jesus was resurrected on Sunday is recognized by all denominations around the whole world. The Bible testifies that Sunday is the first day, not the 7th day of the week. The first day can never be the Sabbath day. Thus, in order to justify Sunday worship, the churches today call it the Lord's Day, since they cannot use the name, the Sabbath day. Everyone, the Sabbath day is the Lord's Day. Jesus said, "The Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath." Also, God clearly stated, the Sabbath day is the Sabbath of the Lord. When we know about even this single law, we can easily distinguish between the church that will be saved and the church that can never be saved. We can also distinguish between the church that receives God's promise and the church that does not. Everyone, we must never go to a church that does not keep the Sabbath day. This is what Jesus has taught. "Away from me, you who practice lawlessness." Can't we discern this matter even with the one word from Jesus? Then, you and I are truly blessed by God. Let's give eternal thanks and honor to God Elohim, God the Father and God the Mother, who have allowed us to dwell in the truth of the Sabbath day. By this, I would like to conclude this sermon. Thank you very much.